When we say light, sometimes we tend to think of this sort of ethereal mist as though the light itself were somehow occupying space. And while that's true to an extent, the much more important bit about light, as far as creatures with eyeballs go, is how is that light reflecting off of objects? That's really what you're seeing. We're not seeing the light so much as we are the things the light are reflecting off of, unless we're staring directly at the source of the light. So in everyday life, air particles, water, your desk, a tree, things in front of you, etc. So then a good place to start with trying to understand how to best manipulate light is to come at it from the perspective of in what way are these surfaces affected by the light, and to sort of get it out of your head that light is this type of mist which occupies a space. So if lighting in 3D is really about how the surface of all our objects are being handled, then we should start out by talking about the different modes of viewport shading, or basically the different way in which the surfaces of our objects in the scene are represented. So by default, we start out in this solid viewport shading. So the solid viewport shading uses internal lamps to represent the lighting. So if we were to add some objects, press Shift A, add a torus, press Shift A, add a cone or something. Really, the idea behind the solid viewport shading is to be this totally ambiguous lighting that's supposed to just very simply represent the objects within the scene. We can kind of think of the solid viewport shading as without light, even though there is, actually a behind the scenes internal lighting system going on. Because no real light source is supposed to be really represented in solid viewport shading, there's no sort of shadow display. You'll notice down here in the camera view that we do see shadows, because this is actually by default material viewport shading, wherein the surfaces are being applied and used. And so if we have textures, images, and things like that on our objects, they'll also show up here. Another way to look at these viewport shading modes is that they progressively get more and more detailed, getting closer to what your final rendered image will look like. So if we start out with bounding box, this is the most simple display of our objects, and a bounding box is just a wireframe box that encompasses the full length, width, and depth of the object. On the next step, we have wireframe mode, and the wireframe mode gives us an actual representation of the polygon shapes, but we're still not seeing any actual surfaces. In solid viewport shading, we finally do get to see a representation of the surfaces, although things like lighting, materials, shadows, and stuff like that aren't really accessible to us. Next, we have texture viewport shading, which I never use texture viewport shading. Texture viewport shading is just a mildly scaled back version of material viewport shading. Material viewport shading has just a few more features that more properly represent your materials. So I typically never even use texture. I just keep this on material. Finally, we have rendered, which gives us a render preview of our objects, which is the most resource heavy. Starting at the bottom, we have the least resource heavy, bounding boxes, which aren't very hard for your computer to compute at all the way up to rendered, which gives us a render preview and can properly display reflections, ambient occlusion, and a bunch of different stuff going on with materials and lighting. I'm going to go ahead and press Shift A, and under Mesh, add a plane, and press S to scale, just so we can see the casting of these shadows a little bit more. Now, the reason why these shadows look so rough is that while we're in the 3D view, the shadows are being represented with what are called buffer lamps. And this is just so if our scene gets really complicated, we're not slowed down by the computer also trying to render really nice looking shadows. However, if you'll notice down here in our camera view, if we press our render preview button, when it's actually time to render, these shadows will be taken care of and look really good. So we are in Blender render mode right now, but there's definitely a difference in the Cycles render engine as opposed to the Blender render engine. One of the main differences is that we don't get buffer shadows in Cycles render. However, anything from solid and below will show up basically the same whether you are in Cycles render or Blender render. So I'll switch that back to Blender render for now. By default, when you start up a new file and you're using Sensei format, you'll see this lamp down here called Scene Light. And if we click the plus sign next to it, this will expand everything that has been parented to this light. So this is actually two lamps here. We have this scene light, which is of the type hemi, which we'll get into all these different types in a little bit. And then we have this second light here called shadows, which is actually a spotlight. And you can tell that because of the little icon here. The purpose of these two default lamps is to allow us to control some default settings for our scene within our lights menu down here in the director's chair. So if we click on this lights menu, and so I'll just drag this over here. So first of all, we have scene brightness. So if I drag this down, we'll notice two things. One, the white world environment background that we currently have in use gets darker. Also, the energy of our default scene lamp gets lower too, down to the point where we can make everything completely black. Click back on here and we can drag this value up some. Next, we have shadow darkness. Separate from the brightness and darkness of the scene, we can actually control the darkness and the lightness of all the shadows produced. So right now, pretty much only one's being produced because we only have this one object here casting, but I could, add a few more objects here. So we could see more shadows. And once again, these rough buffer shadows, this is only to represent our shadows in the 3D view without eating up too many resources. But if we were to render preview or we were to actually render this out, they would render all nice and smooth. So going down the list here, we also have shadow blur. Shadow blur is an element which won't really update live in the 3D view unless we're doing a render preview or actually render our scene out. So right now, if I were to press my render preview button, we can see a fairly crisp edge of these shadows. But if I were to increase this blur quite a bit, then you can see that the edges and the shadows themselves get blurred. And if I drag this down, they get crisper. And then so that's how we can get an idea of what's going on there. So just remember when you're adjusting the shadow blur to turn on the render preview so you can actually see what's going on. Next up, we have exposure and gamma control. These values don't really change anything going on with the lamps. This is more to do with how your overall scene will display when it renders. And you can actually adjust these after it renders as well. So if I were to press my render button, I've got this really dark rendered image here, but you can actually control these exposure and gamma values even after you render, which is kind of nice. I'll press go back here. Of course, the ambient and mist options we discussed in a previous video, so go check those out if you haven't already watched those. And so our options change up a little bit when we are in cycles mode, especially this lights menu here as opposed to blender render. And if you're going to be switching back and forth between blender render and cycles, then I recommend either doing that through the zero brush material options by pressing Q. You can either press use cycles here, or you can, under our this option here, press use cycles, which will do the same conversions for us. It does things like convert all your lamps to cycles lamps and back to blender render, as well as anything you've painted with zero brush. You can also get to this menu by pressing this little blank sliver between these two buttons in the zero brush menu. You can press use cycles here. But anyway, if we press use cycles and we click on our lights menu, we don't really have the options for shadow darkness or shadow blur. This is mostly due to the way that the cycles render engine works. Now it's possible to set up material nodes in a way where you can get more detailed control over the way shadows display in cycles, but it's just beyond the scope of the options here currently. Now we do have another option available in cycles mode in the lights menu that we actually don't have in blender render, and that is these quick lights. And quick lights is actually a feature of zero brush, which rather than using lamps as the source of light, if we turn on quick lights here, you'll notice that the background becomes black, and this is so no additional light is coming from anything other than the sources generated from the quick lights, which is really useful when you're testing materials and you just need a quick lighting setup. So if I press my render preview button with the quick lights on, you notice now that we have a much more dynamic lighting setup. And you'll also notice these big round circle planes show up out of nowhere. And there's actually 4 of these. Of course, once you have that activated, when you control the scene brightness, it will control the lightness and darkness of those quick lights. And I'll turn my render preview off, and we can of course deactivate those anytime we want. Okay, so now that we've got our basic lighting introduction out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about Blender's different lamp types. So if we press Shift A and under lamp here, you'll see we have 5 different lamp types: the point, sun, spot, hemi, and area. And when in cycles mode, the hemi basically functions just like a sun lamp because there's not really a hemi lamp source type for cycles, as you'll notice. So if we were to add a hemi here, you'll notice that here under lamp it says not supported, interpreted as sun lamp. So just so you're aware of that. So really there's 4 lamp types we can use in cycles, whereas we have 5 available to us in Blender Render. So down here in my library here, I'm going to click on my examples folder and then click my expand library button. And I'm going to drag this intro to lamps.blend file into my 3D view to open this up. It's not super important that you have this file to follow along with the rest of the tutorial. It's just basically to have some stuff to look at as we use lamps, but you can download this file if you would like to use it in the description of this video. So I'm going to go ahead and close up my library here. Since we're going to be going over the lamps, let's go ahead and get rid of the default scene lamps here. So I'm going to select the shadows and shift select the scene light here and press X to delete those. And as soon as I do, notice that everything goes black. That's because we are in material viewport shading. But when you're in material viewport shading, the light is no longer just being generically created behind the scenes as it is in solid viewport shading. The representation of everything in your scene becomes dependent upon the material surface properties as well as the actual lamps. And that's why we can display shadows and things like that. And this will remain so until we add some lamps. So let's add some lamps. I can either press Shift A to bring up my add menu and add something where my 3D cursor is, or of course we can do the fast way of just double right clicking under lamp here. Let's go ahead and add a point lamp. A point lamp can be thought of as basically a light bulb because light from a point lamp extends in all directions from that lamp. So if I were to press G to grab and move this point lamp, we can see clearly the light moving along as though this were a sort of light bulb. You can't really rotate point lamps because the light is shooting out from every direction from where they are. Let's go ahead and open up our preview and lamp options over here in our object properties, which displays properties related to whatever object you have selected. So currently we have this point lamp selected. So here's our options for that. First up, we can change the color. We can set the color of this light to anything we want, which is really cool. We could hit D to duplicate this lamp and change the color of this. Duplicate this, change this color to something else. And real quickly, you can start getting some really beautiful, interesting lighting with just these point lamps. Another really fun thing we can do is animate these values. So I could actually tap I over this color and you'll see that it gets highlighted when I do that. I could go ahead and close that up because I don't really need to see this bottom keyframe here. And I could right click and drag my cursor down a second or so, click this color and change it to something else. Let's say some kind of reddish orange here, and tap I again. And we'll now see that color pulse into the other one, which is really cool. So I could like drag my timeline, grab a frame here, press D to duplicate that first one. And so now we've got a back and forth of this color changing. We can, of course, control the energy or how bright each lamp is, and we could animate those values too if we wanted. Pretty much most of these values are animatable, which is really cool. You can change the different energies of these different lamps here, which would, depending on if we had different colors, increase how much that color is going to flood the area. Over here, a negative, so that basically just means the opposite of that color. So it was green, and on the color scale, this purpley color is the opposite of this particular green. This layer only, so if we check mark this, then this will only give light to objects on the same layer. Specular affect the shininess of objects. So you can see when we remove the specular value of this green that the shininess over here is taken away pretty much, and diffuse, which is the regular color value of objects, So here, if we just leave this on specular, we're just going to get those green highlights, the shininess, without the actual green light affecting the diffuse, the basic colors of the rest of the objects. These settings are pretty good how they are. We can control the distance of which the effect will fall off, but you shouldn't have to worry about that too much. I'll go ahead and close that up. Custom properties, this is just if you have more advanced scripts running to affect your lamps, which we don't. And under shadow, you can control whether you want this lamp to produce ray shadows, that is the nice crisp looking shadows that happen when you render, or no shadow at all. If we click ray shadow here, we're not going to be able to see a representation of the actual shadows in the 3D viewport. However, if we go to render, so if I were to press my render preview button, we can see a little bit here where the green specularity is shining from where we left that value on. We can see where the light is casting the bit of a shadow where this segmented bit of the Blender logo is here. So this stuff down here, the sampling and so on, this is about how much detail should go into the ray trace shadow. You don't really have to worry about this because you can control these values directly with the shadow blur option in the director's chair lights menu down here. So if I were to press render preview, we can see that crisp shadow there, but if I click the lights menu and pull this over, and under shadow blur, I drag this up, and you can just keep your mouse pressed down and just hold on this value so the menu doesn't go away once you adjust the value, and we can just control blur and kind of the samples and values that go into these shadows pretty easily without having to adjust any of that other technical stuff there, which is pretty nice. So as long as we're using the Sensei format options to switch between blend render and cycles, then all of our lamps should be automatically converted for us. So I could either press Q and press use cycles, or just down here, click on the menu and press use cycles. All these lamps have now been converted for cycles. However, the lights will display, but the setups are going to be different because cycles lamps use nodes. So if we click under the nodes here, and we were to press our render preview button down here, we're not able to really see the effects of these lamps that much because the strength needs to be a lot brighter on here, or we need to turn down our background. So we could, under scene brightness, lower this a lot and press render preview. Now we're able to see the different point lamps casting a bit better, but still we would probably want to greatly increase these node strengths for each one of these. And we can see those a bit better there. Maybe increase those even more, and so on. So there's a lot more options and things we can do with these cycles lamps, but we're going to save that for another tutorial, trying to kind of brush the surface of these lamp types. But if you wanted to experiment with adding stuff to, say, the color, you could click here and check out these different node types. Not all of them are going to do something, but some of them will. This is a good opportunity to point out that Cycles has become the dominant render engine within Blender because it's really awesome. It can create photorealistic results. However, so much of Blender's user interface was designed around the regular Blender render engine. And so it's really nice to be able to switch back and forth between the two because the Blender render engine gives us a much better live update when we're working in our 3D view without doing a render preview such as this. So basically we're not able to see any of the lighting effects at all when in Cycles render, but if we were to turn the render preview off and switch this back to Blender render by turning off Cycles, we're of course able to get a live update of the effects of these lamps. It's good to know a little bit about the Blender render engine so that you can be able to work in this live view and get better updates about the way things look without having to do a render preview. And also it's good to have a basic knowledge of the Blender render engine because a lot of the way things work in the default Blender render engine are similar to the way many video game engines and other 3D engines work, and it's good to have a basic understanding of it. Down in my outliner here, this is currently set to display visible layers. We can change this to same types, and then this will display all the type of objects within the scene that are the same. If we switch this from visible layers to same types, then we'll be able to see only the lamps we have in our scene. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and shift select these other two lamps, and it doesn't really matter which lamps you delete. We just want to leave one point lamp around, and press X to delete those. I'll press Shift A, and under lamp, let's add a sun type lamp. You'll notice that we have a lot more options available to us with the sun lamp. I'm going to go ahead and close up the sky and atmosphere and the shadow, and we'll get to that in a second and display the regular lamp properties here, which you can see are basically the same as the point. Also notice up here that we can actually change the type of lamp on the fly. So this sun lamp is called sun here, but I could actually switch this to a point, sun, spot, hemi, area, and so on if I wanted to. Just be aware that if you're going to change one of these, the name of it's not going to change, so you might want to manually change that. So say I decided, you know what, I want this to be a spotlight instead. You would probably want to go ahead and rename this to spot or something meaningful, just in case you did that. Okay, so the big difference with the sun lamp, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the effect of the point lamp by clicking this render icon button. When we're talking about lamps, if you want to turn off the visibility of their effect, you can just turn off the render icon. If you want to hide the actual lamp itself, you click the eye icon, and that hides its visual representation of itself. But to hide its effect, you do the render icon. The main difference with the sun lamp is that whereas the position of the point lamps will affect the way the lighting is displayed. So if I hide that, turn that on, and grab this point lamp, the position has meaning with the point lamps. It's basically the exact opposite with the sun lamp. So if we hide the visibility of the point and turn the sun lamp back on, if we press G to grab and move this sun lamp, that's not going to do anything. However, if we press R to rotate it, all of a sudden we do notice that things are happening. So it doesn't really matter where you position your sun lamp. However, rotating it will control the direction of the lighting within your scene. And once again, we can change the colors here to whatever we wanted, and so on. I'll go ahead and turn that back to white though, adjust the energy. And I'll close that up for now. Under shadow, we have the same options as we did with the point. We can turn on ray shadow. Only with the sun lamp, we get the added bonus of being able to see a representation of the shadows live in the 3D view. So Blender's real finicky about which lamps it wants to show 3D view shadows for and not. Just know that if you do have shadows activated, at the very least, if they don't show up in the 3D view, they will show up when you render. So if I were to render preview right here, we can see all the shadows there. And then if I were to press no shadow, then of course the lamp won't be casting shadows anymore. So I'll turn that back on, press render preview. And I think I would like to blur those shadows up just a little, so I'm going to increase this shadow blur a bit. Turn that off. Okay, so the other big bit about the sun lamp is the sky and atmosphere. So right now, if we were to press render preview, the lamp is just doing what we talked about. It is projecting global light from whatever direction we happen to have it rotated to. But if I turn on sky, this gives us a bunch of new options, but what most of these options are really about is using atmospherics, things like turbidity, which have to do with the way moisture or fluids distort light, blending, and other options. So now with that turned on, if I were to press render preview, we get sort of a haze included with the light. And it's kind of hard to tell, I think, with this point lamp. So I'm going to turn the visibility of that point lamp off and increase the turbidity here, and we activate atmosphere. So I could maybe decrease this, and let's go ahead and turn the brightness up. Maybe rotate this some. Then we've got some presets here for the sun, such as mountain. And yeah, you can see the effects of the turbidity a lot better with the mountain presets here. So as we increase this, you can see this kind of hazy atmospheric working here, which is pretty cool. And we also could set this to desert. And we get that kind of desert vibe, which is much clearer because there's much less moisture within the atmosphere. And you have some various other options that you could toy around with. So if we turn off our render preview button and we switch over to cycles, We don't have those default atmospheric controls. However, a way to get something close to that real quickly in this sun lamp here in Cycles is to, on color, click this and select sky texture. And so if we hit our render preview button here, we have similar control of turbidity here. We could increase the brightness, which needs to be quite a bit brighter. And we're getting those same kind of atmospheric effects here as well. And then of course we would want to adjust our actual world background too, but we'll save that for another video. But you can get those same kind of basic controls that you have with the Blender Render one by adding a sky texture, which is pretty useful. All right, let's head on back over to Blender Render by turning off Use Cycles. Okay, so on to spot lamps. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the visibility of this sun lamp and its effect in our scene here. Press Shift A, which will bring up my add menu, and let's add a spotlight here. And so long as we're in Blender Render, we can of course see the effects of this spotlight here, which is what you might expect, circa old 1940s prison break movies. With a spotlight, both the position and the rotation affects how the lighting will display. We'll get to the rest of the settings of the spot lamp here in a second, but let's cut to the chase of what you really want to know. How do you display the actual cone shape of the lamp? Click Halo. That's what you do. And notice up here in the preview that this will show up when we press that. And we're not able to see that in the 3D view live update, but if we say come down here in our camera view and press our render preview button, we can see the kind of volumetric cone shape of the spotlight in addition to the rest of the effects there. We can control the intensity of the cone shape. So if we were to decrease this, this will lower that a bit, which it definitely needs. And so this lowers the intensity of that without actually lowering the energy of the overall lamp. So if we were to lower the energy all the way down, it would get really dark, and we can make it brighter, but easily control the opacity of kind of the cone shape there. Turn my render preview off. It would be great if this effect were that easy to use for the spot lamp in Cycles, which we can use the spot lamp in Cycles. However, to get the same kind of halo effect requires setting up some volumetrics with it both within the scene and within material nodes for the spotlight itself. And we'll get into that in the future, but it's a bit beyond the scope of this introduction to lamps. And as with the point and the sun lamp type, we can of course change the color of this lamp. We can increase or decrease the brightness by controlling the energy. Down here under spot shape, we can control the size of the actual circle of the shape here by controlling this value here. And the blend, which controls the softness and hardness of the edge of the spot shape. And then of course we already went over controlling the halo intensity here, but we have to have render preview on to actually see what that's going to look like here. Shadow control, which currently this is set to buffer shadow. And whereas on the sun and the spot, if I close these up, we have just the no shadow or ray shadow. On the spot, we have buffer shadow and ray shadow. So basically the buffer shadow controls how the lamp's shadows and such look live in the 3D view. And then ray shadow is for what it will look like when we render it. So typically you want to leave this on ray shadow. If you accidentally leave this on buffer shadow and then you go to render, it's going to render out crappy buffer shadows. So just keep that on ray shadow in general. Before we move on to the hemi and the area lamp types, I want to point out that the hemi and the area lamp types are very similar to the functionality of the sun and the point. If we turn off the visibility of this spot lamp, both its effects by clicking the render icon and the visibility of it by clicking the little eye icon, and double right click over here, and let's add a hemi. The hemi works very similar to the sun in that its actual position doesn't mean anything, but the rotation of the lamp does. The only real difference between the hemi and the sun lamp is that rather than the strength of the hemi lamp being centered directly from where the lamp is, it's bowed out a bit. The point of this is to better represent outdoor lighting, but when, like, say the sun's not in full display. So say there's a general hazy cloudiness, and so you have basic lighting coming from the direction of the sky somewhere, but it's not so centered. That's why these lines bow out like this. It's kind of means a sun lamp that's kind of like spread out a bit. So once again, the position, the same as the sun, means nothing with the hemi light, but the rotation will change the way the lighting displays. And also we don't get shadows from a hemi lamp, so not really one that I use too often. And the area light is very similar to the point light in that its position does matter. Really, the main ways in which the area lamp is different from the point light, besides the fact that you can rotate it, is that rather than the light emanating from every angle, it emanates from a shape, basically. So right now it's set to square and the size is 0.1, which is really small. But if we increase this, you can see the actual shape from which the light is coming from. This is sort of similar to the way adding an emission node in cycles is. So if I switch this over to use cycles, and under lights, I turn on my quick lights here and we press the render preview button, which the quick lights are hidden until we are either render or do a render preview. In this scenario, light is actually being shot off from the entire surface of these big circle shapes, which are actually just planes with smoothing on them. And so the area lamp works very similarly to that. So if I'll turn render preview off and turn off my quick lights and switch back to Blender render, the area works very similar to that. The point of it being called area means a light being shot off of either this square or rectangle shape, as opposed to light just being emitted from a single point, kind of like a light bulb with the point lamp. And also, we can't really see the effects of the area lamp at all while in the 3D view. Like I said, Blender's a bit finicky about which lights it wants to display, how it wants to display shadows. So it just takes a little while to get used to that. But if we were to press the render preview button, we can see the way this area lamp is working. In some ways, it's kind of a combination of the spot and the point lamp, with the addition of the overall area where light is being shot out from can be, a very large shape rather than just a single point. And then so we have control of shadow here. We could switch this over to ray shadow. And of course, as soon as we do that, you see down here, since we have render preview on. And of course, it is different from the spotlight in that we don't have the option to turn on the halo effect, which would basically make a square shape of light coming down. So I'm going to turn that off and turn the rest of these on. Just so we have some weird lighting going on here. Okay, so that about wraps it up for a basic introduction to Blender lamps and lighting. And also we're beginning to get our feet a little bit wet in the Cycles render engine. More on that to come in the future. There's an incredible amount of artistic freedom to be had in playing with just lamps. If you did nothing else but model mesh and then work with lamps, you could probably have months of really cool things to discover, create, and dive into. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.